So my my involvement in the topic in recent months has been in preparation for a response to a local government proposition that we address the climate emergency by adaptation, and I'm all in favour with making changes to our city here, which alleviates the problems which climate change are bringing on. But our local government here subscribes to the very, very popular view that we can now mitigate, that we can take actions to either slow down the climate emergency, or we can actually reverse it. In fact, I think the New Zealand government here is one of the few governments in the world which has actually now got it's passed into law the course ahead for us to mitigate, to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Now, this, as I'll shortly explain, and probably some of you realise, is just complete mythology. We've gone way past the point of being able to mitigate this by probably about 50 years. So what I'll do is I'll bring up on my screen some of the points which I've made, and I've got some questions too, and which some of you might be able to answer for me. If I can share my screen, I'm just going to let Angela in to join our meeting. I think this is going to stay on the side of my screen. Yes. So this is the, I hope you can all see that. This is the a part of this paper and response which I've made. Now, this, of course, is no news to any of you, that the carbon cycle is out of equilibrium, and so the Earth is no longer. It's actually, equilibrium means that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, or carbon in particular, has been almost level, the amount emitted and the amount sequestered or absorbed back into the system. But the thing which I found from a paper, well, at the bottom here, this paper here, contributions of natural systems and human activity to greenhouse gas emissions, indicated that anthropogenic emissions accounted for approximately 55% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions based on a 2016. So that's, you know, just over half the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, or greenhouse gases, were from human sources rather than from nature. So almost the same at quantity. But I've made this claim that natural greenhouse gas emissions are now rising at such a rate that reducing or mitigating anthropogenic emissions to reduce global surface temperature or slow the increase of temperature is a lost cause. Now, in discussion with Kevin, I found that, you know, I asked them this question: what evidence have we got that maybe this is the case, that that greenhouse gases from nature are sort of become now the main source? And one indication is during the COVID lockdowns. Now, apparently last year, during the industrial slowdowns and factories closing and all that sort of thing, less traffic on the roads and planes flying, etc., dropped as much as 25%. Now, I got that information actually from a couple of United Nations IPCC reports. The figure may not be quite that high, but during that time, of course, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere continued to rise. So that would indicate that there's, that nature's cranking up its emissions. The second part of this is to consider these self-amplifying feedback loops. Now, some of you, any questions before we go any further on that? Any discussion about that? Let me just see if I can stop sharing. We can all see here again. So yeah, I'm actually wanting to find some more concrete evidence that because of warming, the Earth is generating more greenhouse gas emissions than what we're pumping out of factories and the rear end of automobiles, etc. I think Kevin's explanation that CO2 levels have increased while CO2 emissions have decreased during COVID is one good evidence. But I'd really like to find something more about that. Maybe everyone's a bit too nervous to do their research on it. I'm not sure. What do you think, Kevin?
I can't multitask and do this successfully and go off and do proper searches now. But I think that's a good question that we can all look to answer, and we can do that in our various forums afterwards and see what contributions people come up with.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know relative to anthropogenic industrial emissions how much feedbacks are, but we know that they're in Guy McPherson's Monster Climate Change essay, there are six dozen feedback loops, and the bulk of them are irreversible. So all of those are gaining momentum, and I think that's the whole thing that we have to remember is that build up of momentum that is happening live and direct.
Yeah.
So even the statistics that we get today, they'll be out of date straight away, purely and simply because of the lag between emissions and when we see their effect.
For those of you who have just joined, we're just talking about what seems to be true about greenhouse gas emissions, in that the greenhouse gas emissions from nature itself due to warming seem to be now greater than the greenhouse gas emissions which are caused by human activity, industry, etc. And that is one argument regarding the futility of trying to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2030 or 2050 or whenever, because we could remove humans from the planet and nature's still going to continue to increase the greenhouse gas emissions maybe for, I don't know, hundreds of years at least. So that's so what we've just been asking is can we find some more solid evidence for that and for that claim? One indicator is that CO2 emissions CO2 concentration levels continued to increase last year during COVID lockdowns around the planet. If I can continue then, with talk about self-accelerating feedback loops, and I'll just share a screen with you. Here we go. So I found a few months ago this quite good website. It's called feedbackloopsclimate.com. You see there's an introductory thing there between the Dalai Lama and Greta Thunberg, which is a pretty pathetic sort of a bit of a commentary. But it's got on this website 4 very good short documentaries on these feedback loops, one that pertains to forests, permafrost, atmosphere, and the albedo effect. They're worth watching, but what I found really quite surprising was at the end of each of those, they talk about the measures we can do to counter self-accelerating feedback loops. And I thought, this is just jolly nonsense. And my reason for that argument is that, as you are probably all well aware, you know, how feedback loops work, and they're self-perpetuating and accelerating. What's triggered them is our release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But you can see that this is not a part of the loop. So you can remove human-generated greenhouse gas emissions, which themselves warm the planet. but they're not a part of the feedback loop. So there's nothing, I mean, there is nothing that we can do by way of mitigation to slow down or stop a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Does that make sense to everybody?
Absolutely, it does to me. And I think what's integral to what we're talking about at this moment is the most recent lies from the liar Michael Mann from Penn State University, where he said the absolute opposite of what you just said. Him and his colleagues came up with the hockey stick theory, which described how the temperatures will ramp up as these feedback loops kick in. And now that they've kicked in, he's come out and said the most unscientific bullshit that if we stop emissions, the temperature will stabilize. Well, how the fuck does if manifest? There is no freaking if.
Yeah.
And then he ignores those feedback loops that he became renowned for identifying. This is the cognitive dissonance that we see at the edge of extinction, where no one can face it and they have to come up with some hopium fucking story. It's extraordinarily unscientific.
Any of you others like to comment? For me, my whole focus is on this mitigation myth. And as I said, our government here in New Zealand has actually got it in law that that we have to start mitigating. And I call it virtue signaling. It's because, you know, these international agreements exist and different countries are making their best to reduce carbon emissions, believing that it's going to mitigate the situation. Whereas I say this is a myth. The evidence indicates that we've left it far too late. We're in runaway climate change and it can't actually be either slowed down or reversed. So I see this as the major fallacy, which so many, you know, if you like, greenies and people who have genuine concerns about what's happening have been led to believe. You're on mute there, Alan, but we started this conversation with you in there. Do you have any comments that you'd like to make?
Well, yes, I saw a man on, I guess, well, Facebook, and we did in fact say that if we could reduce all carbon emissions immediately, which people are always saying that if we could do that, that temperatures would drop and that we would get back down to normal somehow. But I mean, it was quite a remarkable statement on his part. So yeah, he's I guess he's at it again. Yes, and in fact, this whole mitigation thing is what everybody is jumping on the bandwagon. I mean, that's kind of what the so-called new Green New Deal is about, isn't it? And these other things, getting back to carbon zero. The paper that the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory recently published is really, it's all on this, you know, net zero mitigation stuff. So yeah.
Yes, I think the reality of it, or the reality of the predicament, is in what I'm just going to share on the screen now. This is from the Our World Data website. And this is a graph which has now been removed from that site, but it indicated that in order to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, these are the measures that needed to be taken in terms of the amount of, you know, carbon spewed into the atmosphere. So, you know, like the longer you leave it, the harder it gets. Well, they've replaced this graph now with this one here. What we need to do to keep global temperatures rise below 2 degrees Celsius. And they've extended it out to, you know, this kind of like line here. So, you know, it gets a little bit more ridiculous as time goes on. And of course, the goalposts keep getting changed.
I noticed that on that graph, they didn't say what year they were using as a baseline.
True.
And baseline dishonesty is one of the biggest breaches of scientific the precautionary principle, by not taking the most cautious approach to it, which is go back. And I talk about going back to 1750, but really we should go back to the beginning of civilization, because that's when anthropogenic changes took place. So always they understate the amount of warming and when the baseline that they're working from is.
Yeah, that was the question I had, if they knew what baseline was that graph was based on, the number, if they knew.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. I see we've got Linda with us too. Welcome, Linda. Whereabouts are you, Linda? Which part of the world are you from? She's adjusting her camera. We've also got Andrew. Welcome, Andrew and Angela. So yes, interested in any further comments that others have got about what I call this mitigation myth. I think that's what we need to drive home. I'm a great supporter of whatever measures we can make to adapt to the changing situation, but to deny the reality. And it was interesting. I don't know if any of you saw that discussion that was held between Sir David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg. And at one point of the conversation, Sir David Attenborough asked her, "Are you an optimist or a pessimist?" And she replied, "I'm neither, I'm a realist." The answer took him a little bit by surprise, I think, because he had to agree with her that one has to be a realist. Yet just yesterday, I was sitting down watching one of David Attenborough's latest documentaries. I'm not too sure how old it was, actually. It's one where he kind of does a survey of his life's work. And he certainly paints the picture very well about the dire situation that we're in. And that's such valuable information. I mean, there's nothing has quite so much an impact as, I think, his description of where the planet's going in terms of wildlife and nature. But of course, he comes back to this sort of like semi-optimist position of, well, we can fix it. We can turn this around. And so he's yet obviously to make that admission of a realist that we can't. Yeah. Justin, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the idea of the mitigation myth. I feel like for some people, mitigation is an excuse to lessen the burden. Like the more we support solar panels or nuclear, the less I have to, in my personal life, invest in being more environmentally conscious and seeing what's going on. And a lot of people don't check into the resources that are required in terms of constructing solar panels en masse, in terms of constructing nuclear plants, the amount of concrete, the carbon intensive processes that go into constructing a lot of, alternative and quote unquote renewable energies. I feel like that plays a lot into the mitigation myth, because there's a lot of factors that increase pollution and kind of further climate change that people aren't looking into. And because there's the notion of the Green New Deal, it allows them to kind of back on the couch and say, okay, well, someone's going to take care of it now. I don't have to be as stressed as I was next year about it.
Yes, I think, we can be positive about the different, if you like, mitigation measures that are being taken. It's a good thing to plant more trees. It's a good thing to reduce emissions. But it must come within the realization that while those things are good in themselves, they're not actually going to mitigate from the dire situation that we're in and are heading towards. So, you know, I'm not suggesting, okay, go and buy a nice big flash car with a V8 motor in it and whatever and burn more petrol. But really, it doesn't make much difference whether you do or you don't, because of what we've just said about these feedback loops and nature taking over with greenhouse gas emissions.
My take on that is that absolutely we should do the best we can. Absolutely, as individuals, we should take our foot off the accelerator. Absolutely plant a tree. Do anything possible to make it better for the other species, but don't fucking lie about it. Tell the truth. Surely the youth deserve the truth at this late stage. It's like trying to tell kids that the smoke in their room and the flames that's burning their asses aren't a problem. It's only a problem for the future, but their asses are getting burnt now.
Anyone else like to make a comment or ask a question or?
Yeah, I could ask a question. Now, as far, I was on an earlier Zoom call with Joey and Jeffrey, and we talked about the methane release in the Arctic and how that's a much faster greenhouse gas than our normal carbon. The feedback for methane is, if I remember from the Zoom call, we were talking anywhere from 6 to 12 months after its release. It really has that feedback. I guess my question is, what is, what is the amount of methane? Is there already enough methane that is spewed out to already heat the planet to on runaway heating? Just methane alone?
I wouldn't say so. No, I think we're on that path.
Yeah, and that was in the second link that I sent, where in his guy's big update, there are papers in there going back to 2009. He's got a whole section where he cites papers just on methane. 2009 issue of Geophysical Research Letters, methane bubbling out of the article. There's another one in Science in 2010, Geophysical Research Letters later in 2010. And that's interesting too, because I think we call the baseline 700 parts per billion. Is that right? And I think that's the 1750 baseline. Does that ring a bell with everyone? And just for the fun of it, when I had nothing better to do, methane is one of those greenhouse gases that we have been releasing ever since the industrial civilization. So I think if you go back several thousand years, it's even lower. It's like, I don't know, I think I saw a low of like 300 or something not long after the Ice Age. But, and then, yeah, Anatolia Shakova, like she's got an estimate. You all know her, right? Is that her name?
Yeah.
And with her friend Igor Smilatov. Yeah, so it's well documented. I think it's just a matter of time. And there are around 70 feedback loops, and many of them have multiple papers that are listed in this document. It's quite a resource if anybody is in denial.
Yeah, the methane thing's just really taken off, hasn't it? And exponentially. I don't know if any of you have seen this this article here. I'm just going to share the screen. There was the article, Arctic permafrost releases more carbon dioxide than once believed. And I think you might have shared that one, Kevin. There's an actual scientific paper that relates to it. And anyway, the article says the amount of stored carbon that is bound to iron, because this is, I'm not a scientist, so I can't explain it very well, but they've discovered that that more carbon is being released when permafrost thaws. So when released, is estimated to be somewhere between 2 and 5 times the amount of carbon released annually through anthropogenic fossil fuel emissions. In other words, there's evidence now of this massive release of carbon from thawing permafrost, which we had not recognized earlier. There again, that's really the evidence I was looking for before, isn't it, Kevin? There's some scientific evidence that the amount of carbon just being released from permafrost in Arctic regions is more than human generated, 2 to 5 times as much, perhaps. So yeah, thought that was interesting.
Why we have to remind people about the lag between emissions and their effects. With methane, it's weeks or months. With carbon, it's years. But one other thing I'd like to bring up, you mentioned Natalia Shakova and Igor Semiletov and their work on the ESAS, the Siberian Arctic Shelf. They said that there are stores of something like 50 gigabyte, 50 billion tons of methane. And in a interview I heard with Peter Wadhams, who's in my eyes the preeminent Arctic sea ice expert, he thought that they were being conservative, and he thought it's hundreds of gigatons.
Welcome to you, Pradeep. I can see from the background that you're somewhere in the Arctic. There's a polar bear behind you. Welcome. Have you got any comments you'd like to make? I think your microphone's currently on mute.
The only comments I can make are like in real time with things happening in Texas and all. I mean, I've been writing about this since 2010, and I think we're almost reaching there. Everything. I mean, the frequency and intensity of these extreme climate events are increasing exponentially now. I mean, we are just hardly 1.5 months into the new year, and this year promises to be much more intense than last year. And then I think everything is on the verge of collapsing. If you look at it in an integrated way, the economies everywhere are, the debt has been mounting and inequalities are increasing. People are not able to pay rent. And on top of that, this climate collapsing and social breakdown. Societies are just, societal breakdown, like last year, Black Lives Matter, then all kinds of things, even in, everywhere, various forces, like in India, everywhere, a lot of things are happening, and the deep state is engineering it, like people like George Soros and all of them. I mean, everything seems to be collapsing. I mean, I'm sorry, like that's my view, that it is ecocalypse, climocalypse, and sociocalypse. I've coined all these 3 words about 10 years back, and it's happening in real time now. So it's indeed a privilege being here. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for saying that. It seems like all of these things are integrated when we talk about climate.
Absolutely. They're all interdependent.
Connected. Yeah.
Basically, I'm an economist, and there is a thing called the Leontief model and various models where there are interdependencies. So in an economy, everything is interdependent. The production, the consumption, and similarly in a human body, everything is interdependent. Like the physiocrats, those French economists who are doctors, about 300 years back, they wrote the body is it's in a state of equilibrium because various factors are working together, the homeostasis principle, the blood pressure. Similarly, the planet is like a organic whole. So when you start, when a blood pressure starts, when diabetes starts and all, so the climate is collapsing. At the same time, the economies are collapsing, and parallelly, societies are collapsing. Single families, like children don't respect their parents anymore, most places of the world, and everything is sort of collapsing.
I think one of the great commentators on this, and I think you'll agree with me too, Kevin, is George Sakralides. And when he talks about the cause of all of these problems, he uses the word connectedness or disconnectedness. Our disconnection from nature, our disconnection from our neighbor and each other, our disconnectedness from ourselves. I no longer know who I am because I'm pretending to be someone else. This is the cause of the whole problem on the planet, is this disconnectedness.
And also most humans, with the increase in technology from the 1960s, we have become dehumanized. Like the amount of screen time we take, and we are just looking at the TV or on our mobiles. Even the young kids nowadays, they are doing the same. And we are just like zombies. We are becoming like zombies, and everything is collapsing. I mean, sort of. I mean, I mean, I think it's a lovely time in the sense that it was coming for a long time, and now it's true. And the funny part is most people are still living in their state of denial. 80%, 90% of the world, mainstream media is still not reporting all this and connecting the dots.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think the antidote to this is reconnection, reconnection with our neighbors and our family. We're going to find meaning in life through doing that, and in reconnecting with nature. But of course, most of the world wants to remain disconnected and in their own little bubble. Kevin, come back to you.
I think that we have a role to play of speaking truth to power in this community. I'll be surprised if anyone in this Zoom chat hasn't been attacked and hassled for being so negative and for giving up and all of those stereotypes that are thrown at us. But the kids need to hear the truth from some direction. And I think we've got to give that direction. I hate being in this role. I don't choose to be here. I choose to be here with you guys. But it's my conscience that forces me to be doing what I'm doing. I just think it's important. I'm walking past a house that's on fire and there are young people inside, and I'm not going to shut the fuck up.
Might we hear from some others there? I see Linda, you're not muted, so you got any comment you'd like to make, Linda?
I find it increasingly hard to live in the moment with, on a more personal level, seeing how bad things are getting. And I know, Kevin, sometimes you were talking about how quickly the Berlin Wall fell, and the heat is up, where I feel like that threat of total rug pulled out from under us could be happening any minute. So I'm feeling a little bit more of a stress response than I have in a few years. And on the one hand, wanting to just enjoy what the present is increasingly riddled with moment to moment uncertainty more than before. So on a personal level, I think it's and I sometimes feel like seeing the science and how exponential obviously knowing that it is exponential, but it has really ramped up in the last few months. And I really feel like we're hanging on by a thread. I think systems are collapsing now, and it's just going to compound, and it's coming fast. And I think that's the reason that I just am flabbergasted at Michael Mann. I mean, there's just absolutely no excuse for the things he's saying, knowing what he actually knows. And it's a caricature. It's almost like it's like we're just watching a cartoon at this point, because it's all just going straight into the trash from here. It's kind of the political climate as well.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Andrew. Andrew, you wanted something to say? Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, but I don't need to go. Does someone else want to go first? It's fine. Kevin, do you want to say something?
No, you go, bro.
Oh, yeah.
Or I can go ahead and say something, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So here's my first time here. I gotta first of all say I thank the collective intelligence and scholarly articles that I've read that sort of opened my eyes a bit. My observation is, and this is the ones that make the decision. We seem to have two political class, and there is a necessary checkbox, and I would call it a sort of an aphorism chant, that the mitigation seems to be an aphorism chant of one political class. We can do something about it. We're going to give you some hope. And it's as of necessity for the political life, that's what they do. And the other political class is the ones that, well, certain rights cannot be denied. Of course, they're going to deny climate change to start with. Then behind that is they hide behind, well, it's my right to not to believe or not to believe in certain basic facts. So as long as we have those two in control at odds with each other, seeking power, we're going to be ruled by this great hypocrisy and this great deceit that mitigation will work. Now, I've been a vegan for 30 or more years, based on compassion, and also based then as a young man thinking that it's going to make an impact on climate. And of course, one of the greatest polluters is industrial factory farming. That's one of the greatest polluters in the release of greenhouse gases. So I felt that it's going to make a change. Now I know it does. It's not going to, we're going through a path. Will it change my compassionate belief? Absolutely not. We're going to learn to live in a compassionate manner, whatever comes. I know what's coming. I have a sense of I don't know what's coming, but I have a sense of what's coming. And it shouldn't change our fundamental belief that we can still be compassionate to each other, still have to be loving and caring to each other, still have to be tolerant to each other, in spite of all the hypocrisy our leaders are preaching to us. At the end of the day, we know better, right? It's going to be up to us. The political class is not going to lend truth to us. It's not in their interest, not in their political life or longevity to do so. And both classes, right?
That's a very, very good point, Sachin, because, to expect politicians to face reality and speak about it, they want to get re-elected. They've got the corporations and the capitalists who really don't want anything to change. So that political observation is spot on. Thank you. Yeah. Andrew, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, we talk about collapse. If we just set aside the environmental collapse, which is really hard to set aside because it's so huge, but if we are able to set it aside, if we just look at the economic side, the economic collapse, the days of central banking and fiat currency are at an end. Look at the price of Bitcoin, and like in December it was like 10,000, and now it's at 57,000 per coin. So, and also I could see coming up a precious metal spike. I could see the beginnings of peak oil, which I personally didn't even think that we would get there yet. I thought we'd die before then, right? But this summer I could see there being an energy crisis, like the 1973 oil crisis, where you had lines to get gas, And so between the energy crisis and the end of this central banking system, I think that could happen in 2021.
And of course, let's not forget the war with COVID.
No, yeah, jeez.
Yeah, another one. We haven't talked about that here, and we really don't need to. I think we're all obviously very much aware. Kevin and I actually are very fortunate to live in a country where it's not a problem. But those of you in North America, we really feel sorry for you. Maya, you're on mute, but would you like to contribute something or make a comment for us?
Sure. Yeah, there are so many routes to take in talking about this. So I'm just listening to everybody, and now you just mentioned COVID, and just to pick up on that, I think when I heard the word pandemic last year, I just, I read about the Black Plague. I sort of sensed immediately that this was it. Maybe this was the tipping point. This was something that was so big that it was going to trigger a lot of things. And in fact, it has. It's triggered, it's sort of a word I like to use. It's daylighted economic and social injustices. It's daylighted the climate crisis itself, actually. Suddenly, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and blah, blah, blah are talking about it suddenly, where they were silent before. So that was my feeling about COVID, how that was a kind of trigger for releasing a lot of stuff, triggering a lot of stuff. And I suspect it's going to get worse. That's my feeling. But also what Kevin was saying about young people, I had a thought about that. I have a lot of young friends because I'm in the arts. And when I first learned about climate change through Guy McPherson back in 2013, I think I met him. It took me a few years to, get on board, but then I tried to talk to my young friends about it, and they didn't want to hear about it. I lost all my friends. They didn't want to talk about it. And finally, I found a couple of my friends who I was able to sort of dig a little deeper with them about it. And I said, do you and your friends talk about it? Do you have any consciousness or feelings about it? And he said to me, this is a friend of mine who's, I don't know, he's 30 years old now, I guess. He said, Maya, my entire life has been a crisis. I was born, right after I was born was the, Y2K, or when I was a young person, there was the Y2K crisis, that everything was going to end at the millennia, at the turn of the century. He said, my whole life has been about that. Everything is in crisis. So this is just another one. It doesn't mean that much in that sense, because this is my life. He has nothing to compare it to, in other words. And it's just, that's his existence. And that's how they feel about it. What can we do about it? There's nothing we can do. This is just how it is. It's always been this way. It's a kind of hopelessness that young people have.
Kevin?
I think dealing with their grief and dealing with our grief as the biggest pre-collapse challenge that we are facing.
Yeah.
Justin,
imagine what it's like for a young person knowing that every single thing is going to fall apart and nothing is going to be done about it.
Yeah, they have no hope for that at all.
They're going to be really fucked off with people like me.
And me, still.
A comment there, Justin?
Yeah, no, I can relate a lot to what Maya's saying. I was 15 when the first economic recession hit the United States. And according to a lot of guys' writings, we never really left that recession. We've only kind of coasted into the newest one we've gone into economically. So I've kind of grown up with this notion that things were kind of out of place and hectic. And then when I stumbled upon the information leading me to these types of discussions about how, methane is coming out of the Arctic and how the ice is melting, we're looking at having a blue ocean event either this year or next year. When I started looking upon those kinds of conversations, it kind of clicked already in my predisposed picture of the world that things actually were a lot worse than I thought once I researched them. But it also, on the positive side of that, it's taught me that it's enabled me to look at things like every day better. You know, times I experience with nature, go out and walk in the park and observe trees and birds and stuff like that. It's allowed me to more thoroughly enjoy that, knowing that the time I have to do that isn't very long.
Are you still with us, Pradeep? Can't see your video, but just appreciating some of the comments that you have made, and quite enjoyed. Yes, you're still on mute there. You made this lovely little comment there, Pradeep, about time to read the Vedas, do yoga, meditate, get into a mode which will help us cope with the end of times. I think most certainly, you know, I've taken a great deal of wisdom from Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi and some of those early Taoist philosophers. Also find a great philosopher who lived, who was very popular in the 70s, Alan Watts. You know,
Yes.
living in the now. Life is not a journey. So highly recommend to any of you who want to see what I think is a much better perspective on ourselves and in our situation. By the way, Alan Watts did a couple of things towards the end of the 70s on the environmental situation and his response to that, which is worth looking at. If any of you want to email me or message me, please feel free to do so, and I'll send you a
Yes.
copy of my summary paper, which I've also written.
I just read your blog. It's wonderful, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Pradeep. It's kind of a summary of the paper which I've written, you know, for our local government council here. And I'm probably going to get an opportunity next month to speak to them. But I already know that many will be going like this. We actually really don't want to hear this, because then we might have to feel obligated to change the way we do things. So yeah,
I just wanted to say I heard Greta speak the other day on mainstream media. She was on a cable news show, and this was like MSNBC or CNN or one of those. And they were asking her, it was she and Michael Mann, actually, which was interesting. And and they asked her first to speak, and then they asked Michael Mann to speak. And she's such a clever girl. She was extremely erudite and cautious in how she spoke about it. But it was still, it shocked the journalist. At the end of her little essay or her speech, the journalist said, well, that's not very hopeful. Even though Greta was trying to be as sweet and nice about it as she could be. And then of course, Michael Mann, the same basically, but he's also very, I suspect he's paid by the fossil fuel industries in some way or something. So he's very cautious as well.
One thing to bear in mind about Michael Mann is he's tenured at Penn State. And Penn State have a huge section dedicated to the US military.
Oh, there you go. They're the biggest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet.
I think that they've had a word in Mann's ear and they've told him to back up the truck and buy time. Yeah,
that's it. Exactly. So he's, it's all about the money, right? Yeah. But I was particularly struck by Greta's what's the word I'm looking for? Her, she wasn't being completely brutal and forthright about it. She was being very polite about it, and it still shocked the journalist. So that was interesting.
Yeah, just going back to that comment about the US military, the statistics on their greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, places them well above a number of countries, including here in New Zealand. In New Zealand, by the way, our greenhouse gas emissions are meant to be about 0.1% 0.17% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So the American military way exceeds, you know, New Zealand and a number of other countries, and it's not accounted for in the IPCC.
Oh, is that so?
Reckoning.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not.
We've also got with us at the moment Jeffrey Anderson and S. Lee Spencer. You must be listening. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, even though you're not on video, just go ahead, unmute yourself and go ahead.
I want to say that I'm all about truth and honesty, but I really struggle with sharing this information with grade school children. I guess what I'm saying is it's so hopeless that what would prompt them to get out of bed or get off the computer game? I think that, you know, Kevin's analogy of you're walking by a house and the house is on fire and there are children inside, you know, of course you would want to let them know, but the difference is they can do something. They can save themselves. They can leave the house. We don't have that option here. So I really, really struggle with this. I'm really, I'm very fortunate. I'm an old lady. I'm 67. I have only one son who's 26, who will probably not have any children. So it's easy for me to embrace this reality. I've lived a good life. I have few regrets. But I can just really empathize with people who are much younger, people who have 5 young children. And again, you know, I just really struggle with being able to get behind this level of honesty with people who are much younger.
We all do. I think everybody is struggling with this.
So the point of the bottom line, does it help? Does it help? Are they not more likely to live the rest of their however short life in a more meaningful and enjoyable way because they actually think they're getting somewhere? I don't know, versus like, what the fuck's the point? I'm not getting out of bed. I'm not getting off this computer game. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, is it really better for them to know? I don't know.
Well, my response to that is that I want them to use the time that they've got in a meaningful way and not be sucked into the dominant culture's procession that we all went through, where we all went to school, universities, careers, all planning for a life later on. And these people don't have that. So I think the reason I speak to them about it is I'd like them to do what they want to do now, not later on like we did.
Well, I think there is certainly something to be said for that, but I think that they find meaning in striving, even if they can't realize the gains, if you will. And when you say, you know, I want them to have this knowledge so that they live a more meaningful life day to day, I'm not sure you can trust them to do that. My concern, I'm a psychologist. My concern is that they collapse into a gooey pile and really can't do anything. So however long, and because we don't know. So, you know, it's 18 months, it's 3.5 years. They didn't go to college. They don't have a job. They didn't contribute to their retirement. I don't know. I guess I'm just not optimistic that they'll do what you hope they'll do with the knowledge. Maybe that's the real difference, is that I anticipate that they'll just become clinically depressed and non-functional.
Yeah.
I agree.
Thank you. Jeffrey, you're wanting to say something, and I also note this lovely comment from Andrew. I work as a substitute teacher. I chat near-term human extinction on the daily with teens. That's very interesting, Andrew. Let's just give an opportunity for Jeffrey. Jeffrey's wanting to have something to say and come back to you. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm glad there's a psychologist on. I've been a student of Carl Jung's works for over 20 years, which is a little bit of a different approach than some of the standard psychology. It's where you get terms like the collective unconscious and those types of things. Anyway, but the way that I look at it, I mean, it depends on the audience, or it depends on the individual. I'm not around people who are that young, and I would probably want to know their background and their emotional state. But I'll share experience that this is probably 4 years ago, maybe or so, when there were younger people, so maybe late teens, early 20s, and they made a presentation. It was very kind of like Al Gore, Bill McKibben. It's like, well, we are going to get carbon down to 350, which I think was a lie. And also, one of the main reasons that they were going to do it was by planting trees. And so, like, one of my things with, and they misinterpreted my comment. I think we should plant trees wherever we can, and anybody should if it's possible. But like, what are three obvious things? Number one, we're not even gonna, if we could, from what I've seen, if we could replace every tree that has been planted since the beginning of civilization 10,000 years ago, it wouldn't even take up the interest of the self-reinforcing feedback loops. Number two, much of the habitat is gone for those trees. So just look at the Middle East and Northern Africa. So it would take us more fossil fuels to try to bring in the habitat. And the third is we've got so many human settlements, so many cities and suburbs and farmland that it's just not feasible. So I was trying to talk about those types of things, but my final response is, like, in that environment, they said, oh, you're going to scare them. But I don't know. I am with Kevin in that what good has been done by lying to these people for so long. And I know there are some exceptions, but I just want to say that there isn't an absolute rule. But in this environment, I thought it was better to be truthful and then not to try to control how they're going to respond, because everybody seems to want to make assumptions about how they're going to respond. There are going to be 7.8 billion responses, and I've given up trying to control that. So that was my sort of take on whether we should tell young people, as in a general sense.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey.